In October 2001, a truck sat abandoned beside a Newark warehouse. The keys were in the ignition. The seat was pushed too far back. The driver, 29-year-old Daniel Russo, never came home. Police filed it as routine. Drivers in debt sometimes vanish. Neighbors whispered about a secret romance. Others insisted Daniel stole from his own company. Both stories spread faster than the investigation itself. Yet the only fact was absence. In the apartment, Maria Russo found the torn leather cover of her brother's notebook, pages gone. Some said it was nothing more than a work log. Others called it a mob black book. Years later, one oil-smeared fragment surfaced from a sealed file box. Daniel's handwriting still legible, numbers trailing off mid-line. Fact and rumor collided in grease and ink, and the silence grew heavier. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The October sky hung low over Newark's industrial strip, a lid of gray pressing against rows of warehouses that looked almost identical. The concrete yards smelled of rain and diesel. Trucks rattled past in the distance, but one sat alone, angled wrong. Its hazard lights blinking like an afterthought no one wanted to claim. It was found late in the afternoon of October 23, 2001. The delivery truck belonged to Daniel Russo, a 29-year-old driver who had been working routine routes for nearly a decade. At 4 p.m., the vehicle idled in silence beside a corrugated warehouse wall, nose tilted toward the street as if it had been abandoned mid-turn. Its driver was gone. The responding officers recorded what they saw with detached efficiency. The cab was locked. The keys still dangled from the ignition. A styrofoam coffee cup, half full, sat stiff in the holder, its surface skimmed over by a thin gray film. On the passenger seat lay a folded work jacket. The driver's seat had been pushed noticeably back, further than Daniel ever set it. To anyone who knew his wiry frame, the position was wrong. Someone else had been behind the wheel. The officers noted the details, took photographs, and shut the doors. In the logbook, they marked the situation, missing driver, no evidence of struggle. The truck was towed to the impound lot. The paperwork was thin. At Clifton Avenue, the Russo family prepared for an ordinary dinner. Maria Russo, Daniel's younger sister, had set the table with 3 plates, expecting him home as he always was by dusk. She had cooked lasagna, his favorite, because she knew he had been running double shifts. Their father, Anthony, sat at the head of the table, restless eyes flicking toward the hallway clock every few minutes. By 7 p.m., when Daniel had not arrived, Maria called his phone, straight to voicemail. She dialed again, the same hollow recording. By 9 p.m., Maria was in her car driving Daniel's delivery routes. She stopped at gas stations, asked clerks if they had seen him. She checked diners where drivers usually gathered for late coffee. No one remembered. At 11 p.m., she stapled flyers to utility poles, rain soaking the edges before morning traffic shredded them away. The official report filed that night did not satisfy the family. Under the notes section, the officer had written, "Possible debt, possible voluntary disappearance." Maria underlined the word voluntary 3 times when she later saw a copy. Her brother had routines too ingrained to vanish by choice. He carried the same habits every day. Same jacket, same notebook, same route. The word voluntary felt like an insult. 2 nights later, Maria let herself into Daniel's small apartment. The place looked untouched. The bed was made. A cereal bowl with dried flakes still sat in the sink. She opened drawers, checked behind doors, lifted piles of laundry. She was searching not only for her brother, but for something to explain the gap he had left. On the desk in his bedroom was an empty space where his leather notebook usually rested. Daniel carried it everywhere, jotting down addresses, phone numbers, even reminders to buy milk. Maria remembered the way he would sit at their father's kitchen table, flipping through pages and tapping his pen while their father muttered about bills. The notebook was constant, as familiar as Daniel's keys. Now it was gone. Maria pulled open the desk drawer again, hoping it had slid behind the wood. Nothing. She pressed her fingers against the hollow scrape at the back. Only absence, For her, the missing notebook was louder than any rumor. The next morning, she drove to the impound lot. Through a chain-link fence, she saw Daniel's truck sitting under a layer of mist. Its tires glistened. The interior looked stripped of personality. No papers, no bags, no notebook. The officers said there was nothing suspicious. Maria saw silence where Daniel's handwriting should have been. At night, she lay awake replaying the last meal they had shared. Daniel had come in late, setting his notebook on the table before reaching for bread. He had been tired but quiet, his eyes fixed on the pages he always carried. Maria tried to recall if he had seemed worried, but the memory would not sharpen. All she saw was the leather cover, worn at the corners, a small thread loose at the spine. The warehouse where the truck had been found was unremarkable. It had no nameplate, no logo. Its corrugated siding rusted at the edges. Dozens of trucks used the same lot every day, but in the days after, no one stepped forward to say they had seen Daniel leave his vehicle. The building seemed to swallow the hours around his disappearance. Neighbors speculated quickly. Some said Daniel had run away with a woman. Others whispered about unpaid bills. The police leaned toward the simplest theory. Drivers under financial strain sometimes walked away. The case was marked low priority. For Maria, every explanation missed the point. Daniel's routines were clockwork. The truck left without him, the keys still in the ignition, and his notebook, his constant companion, was missing. Those facts mattered more than any rumor. 2 decades later, the warehouse still stood, its walls streaked with rust, its lot overgrown with weeds. Deliveries came and went, but one story clung to the building. On that first night, while officers marked the truck and Maria stapled flyers in the rain, the warehouse door rattled once in the wind. Then it stopped. The warehouse door rattled once, then silence consumed it. Rain pooled in the gutters along Clifton Avenue as Maria taped another flyer to a lamppost. The paper sagged under the damp, Daniel's face blurred behind drops of water. Drivers honked in the distance, a normal Friday night rhythm that only deepened the wrongness of her brother's absence. The police had called her earlier that day. Their tone was clipped, uninterested. "He's an adult," the officer said. "These things happen. Sometimes people step away." When Maria pressed, the officer added something she could not shake. "We've heard he might be seeing someone. You should consider that possibility." By the time she hung up, the suggestion had already spread. Neighbors whispered about a woman no one had met. An old friend of her father claimed to have seen Daniel at a diner weeks earlier with someone he described as too young, too pretty, not the type you bring home. The story grew in retelling. First a passing glance, then an affair, then an escape plan. Maria sat at her parents' kitchen table, listening as relatives argued. Her father slammed his hand down. "He wouldn't leave, not without telling us." Her aunt shook her head. "Men do foolish things. Maybe he thought he could start over." Each voice layered rumor upon rumor, until Daniel was buried under speculation. Maria refused to believe it. She remembered her brother's steady habits, the way he always checked locks, the way he noted every delivery address in his notebook, the way he phoned if he would be 10 minutes late. He did not walk away. But the police were quick to let the rumor guide their thinking. That night, Maria drove to the diner mentioned in the stories. The place smelled of frying oil and stale coffee. She showed the waitress a photo of Daniel. The woman squinted, shook her head. "Lots of drivers come through. Maybe I saw him, maybe not." On her way out, Maria noticed a stack of order slips by the register, each smudged with grease. The handwriting cramped and hurried. It reminded her of Daniel's small, slanted notes. She thought again of the missing notebook. In memory, it was ordinary. Grocery lists, phone numbers, delivery logs. But with each rumor, the object shifted in weight. Now it was painted as a secret ledger of affairs, a diary of betrayal. Maria hated how easily it was rewritten by those who never touched its pages. Back home, she set one of Daniel's old flyers on the counter. She studied his photograph, neutral expression, faint stubble, eyes tired but clear. She whispered to herself, "He didn't leave us." The house answered with silence. The next morning, she received another call. This time, it was a neighbor down the block. The man claimed he had seen Daniel's truck parked near a motel 2 weeks earlier. "You should check there," he said. "That's where men go when they're not going home." Maria drove to the address. The motel sat hunched beside the highway, neon sign flickering. The clerk barely looked up when she asked. No record of Daniel. No trace in the parking lot. Only the lingering odor of bleach and cigarette smoke. She walked the rows of doors, each identical, each holding a story she could not touch. She left with nothing. Another rumor swallowed itself, leaving her no closer than before. Later, as rain darkened the street outside her parents' house, Maria sat with her father. He turned the flyer in his hands until the paper nearly tore. "They'll keep talking," he muttered. "They'll say whatever makes sense to them. But your brother isn't a man who runs." Maria stared at the damp edges of the flyer, Daniel's blurred face staring back. Every whisper made the silence heavier. On the second week of his absence, she visited the impound lot again. The truck sat under gray tarps, tagged with a case number. She pressed her hand against the cold metal. She imagined the missing notebook on the seat where it should have been, its pages filled with ordinary roots, now twisted by rumor into something it was not. The lot was silent but for the rustle of tarps in the wind. Maria's reflection in the truck's window blurred under the drizzle. Behind her, no one moved. No, a rumor of love drowned the silence of the missing truck. The Newark warehouses all looked the same. Low concrete walls, corrugated siding, faded numbers stenciled above roll-up doors. Trucks came and went at all hours, carrying loads that never appeared on official logs. For decades, people whispered that these lots were more than storage. They were shadows of a trade no one admitted aloud. Maria parked her car at the edge of the strip one cold morning. She watched drivers exchange nods, tailgates lift, crates slide into darkness. To her, the place felt like an endless loop of arrivals and departures, each one a possible moment her brother might have been swallowed whole. She found Tony DeSantis outside a loading bay, smoking. Tony had driven with Daniel on a handful of routes, a friend in the loosest sense. His eyes darted when Maria asked questions. "Danny was nervous," Tony admitted finally, voice low. "Said he had to keep a record. Said it was safer that way." Maria leaned in. "What record?" Tony flicked ash to the ground. "Don't ask me. Just, he didn't like who was giving him side jobs. He wrote stuff down, like names or places. He said if anything happened, it wouldn't all disappear." Forensic details surfaced almost by accident. When investigators had searched Daniel's truck, they logged a crumpled restaurant receipt from a local Italian place. The slip was greasy, folded into the corner of the glove box. On its back, faint handwriting stretched across the paper, half rubbed out. Maria studied the copy at the precinct. The loops of the pen were unmistakable. Daniel's. But the words ended abruptly, the ink trailing mid-sentence. It felt less like a note to himself and more like a warning. At the Russo house, her father stared at the receipt for a long time. "He used to keep every bill, every stub," he said. "That's how I taught him. A man should always know where money goes." The statement was more ritual than memory. In their family, notebooks were anchors, proof of order. Daniel had carried that habit into his life on the road. Now that habit had become dangerous. Neighbors continued to spread their own theories. Some swore they saw Daniel outside a bar days before he vanished. Others said he had argued with his boss. Rumor piled on rumor, burying the faint forensic clue in noise. Maria clung to the handwriting on the greasy receipt because it was the only tangible fact she had. Late that evening, she placed the receipt on her kitchen table, next to her brother's photograph. The paper smelled faintly of oil, as though it carried the warehouse air with it. She traced the half-finished line with her finger, wondering what words had been cut short. The house was quiet, her father upstairs, the hum of the refrigerator filling the gap. She thought about Tony's warning, about Daniel insisting on writing everything down. If the missing notebook still existed, it might hold not just roots, but a map of why he vanished. Maria folded the receipt carefully, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and tucked it away in her bag. She was beginning to think like an archivist, not a sister, keeping fragments, guarding against their erasure. When she stepped outside, the wind carried the smell of diesel from the warehouses. Somewhere in the distance, a truck backfired, sharp against the night. Maria froze, listening, heart hammering, as though it might be Daniel's rig returning at last. But the sound faded, swallowed by the highway. She stood under the flickering street lamp, the plastic sleeve pressed against her chest, the words on the receipt unfinished and unreadable. The handwriting looped like a warning, then cut off mid-line. The Russo kitchen felt smaller with every passing night. Flyers curled on the counter, damp from rain. The answering machine blinked with messages that promised nothing useful. Friends asking for updates, strangers offering sympathy, neighbors repeating the same rumors Maria had already heard. On the 10th day, the family gathered for Sunday dinner without Daniel. The lasagna cooled, untouched on the table. Plates remained empty, forks lined neatly, as though he might still walk in. The silence stretched until their uncle, Vincent, broke it with a low voice. "You should know," he said, pushing back his chair. "Danny wasn't just driving crates from warehouses. He had side work, cash jobs." Maria's father glared across the table. "Side jobs don't make a man vanish." Vincent leaned closer, his tone sharper. "You don't understand. He was carrying more than he should have, and people don't like when notes get written down. He was careless with that little book of his." The mention of the notebook twisted Maria's stomach. She had not told many people it was missing, yet somehow the absence of those pages seemed already known. Later that night, Maria's phone rang. The line was rough, muffled. A voice told her Daniel had stolen from his own company, skimmed off deliveries, and disappeared to avoid retribution. Before she could respond, the caller hung up. Red herring or truth? The contradiction was impossible to untangle. The next morning, Maria took the story to the police. Detective Howard Klein, newly assigned, sat with her in a cramped office. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose, his patience thin. "Anonymous calls happen all the time," he said. "We can't build a case on a whisper. If your brother skimmed, it might explain his disappearance, but without evidence, it's just noise." Maria placed the photocopy of the greasy receipt on his desk. "This isn't noise. He was trying to leave something behind." Klein studied the scrawled ink for a moment, then set it aside. "Could be anything. A grocery list, a phone number. We'll look into it." His tone said otherwise. Maria left the precinct with anger pounding in her chest. Every rumor painted Daniel as guilty, an affair, a thief, a man running. None matched the brother she knew. That night she searched Daniel's apartment again. Drawers yawned open, papers scattered, nothing of value left. But in the bottom of his nightstand she found something she had missed before, a torn leather cover. It was unmistakably his notebook's shell, the spine cracked, edges frayed. But the pages were gone. She lifted it into the light. The cover was warped, as though cut or ripped from the binding. She ran her finger along the tear. Whoever had taken the pages wanted only the words, not the shell. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the empty cover. Childhood images flooded back. Daniel at the kitchen table, tapping his pen. Their father lecturing about keeping records, about how every number mattered. The notebook had been an extension of Daniel's order. Now it was hollow, stripped of meaning, yet dangerous in its absence. She carried it back to her parents' house, laid it on the kitchen table where it seemed heavier than any meal they had eaten there. Her father stared at it without speaking. Her mother crossed herself, whispering a prayer. The family was caught between belief and evidence. To them, the cover was a relic, a ritual object. To police, if they ever bothered to log it, it would be nothing more than scrap leather. The following week, Maria attended a community meeting at the parish hall. Volunteers pinned up missing person flyers, children, runaways, workers never seen again. Daniel's face stared back among dozens, another paper square on the board. A woman approached Maria quietly. "You know what they say," the woman whispered. "The book he carried, it wasn't just addresses. Men like him write things down they shouldn't. Someone always comes looking for it." Maria did not answer. She folded the torn cover tighter against her chest, as if holding the absence might keep the whispers from turning real. Back home, she placed the cover inside a plastic bag, sealing it like evidence. She could not trust the police to treat it seriously. She began her own collection: flyers, the greasy receipt, the empty cover. Each fragment went into a shoebox she kept under her bed, her own small archive against forgetting. Outside, rain hammered the street. The warehouse lots were slick with oil, lights glowing pale through mist. Somewhere in that sprawl, her brother had disappeared, and the missing pages might have carried the reason. Maria lay awake listening to the storm, the shoebox close by. She thought of the anonymous voice, the uncle's whispers, the torn cover. Belief told her Daniel had been careful, honest, devoted. Fact told her the notebook was gone, its words stripped clean. The house groaned under the weight of rain. Pipes clanged. Distant thunder shook the windows. Maria closed her eyes, but the image would not leave her mind. The cover, empty, curling as if to hide its missing spine. Only the torn leather cover lay curled in the drawer. Detective Howard Klein was not the type to chase ghosts. He had handled missing person reports before: runaways, workers who left families behind, debts gone sour. Most returned on their own. Some never did. To him, the Russo file looked no different. But the persistence of Maria Russo and the empty notebook cover she carried into his office in a plastic bag forced him to at least listen. He placed the cover on his desk under fluorescent light. The leather was cracked, the torn edges frayed as though ripped with haste. To Maria, it was evidence. To Klein, it was an object without context. Still, he had been on the force long enough to know that ordinary things sometimes became anchors. "I'll log it," he said, "but don't expect miracles." Maria watched him slip the bag into a larger envelope and seal it. The motion felt too casual, like placing a receipt in a drawer. She wanted the act to mean more. That week, Klein visited the warehouse lot where Daniel's truck had been found. Rain had washed away most surface traces, but the original field notes mentioned impressions in the mud. He requested the photographs. Black and white prints showed a partial boot print mixed with oil stains near the truck's left wheel. The tread was smudged, unmatchable. To Klein, it was thin. To Maria, when shown the photo, it was a sign someone else had stood there. The detective began asking around. Other drivers admitted the warehouses were known for side jobs. Extra crates for cash, no questions asked. Some swore Daniel had turned down those offers. Others said they saw him loitering at loading bays too long, notebook in hand, writing things down. Rumor and fact overlapped until neither could be untangled. Maria kept her own notes. She wrote the word boot print in capital letters, adding it to her shoebox of fragments. The notebook cover, the greasy receipt, the flyers, all layered together, her private archive against disappearance. She refused to let details dissolve into rumor. At family dinners, the tension grew. Their father remained adamant. Daniel had not stolen, had not run away, had not betrayed them. But the whispers of theft reached even the parish. Maria heard them after Mass, in the murmurs of neighbors who lowered their voices when she passed. One evening, she confronted Tony again outside a diner. His cigarette glowed in the dusk. When pressed, he admitted what others only hinted. Daniel carried things off the books sometimes. We all did. But he was nervous, said he had to keep track, said if anyone asked, he'd show them the notes. "What kind of things?" Maria demanded. Tony shrugged, blowing smoke into the wind. "Crates. Maybe electronics. Maybe liquor. Didn't matter. What mattered was writing it down. That was a mistake." Maria's mind caught on the word mistake. The notebook had been ordinary once, a family habit. But now, in these stories, it had become a threat. Detective Klein received a report from a patrol unit that checked the warehouse again. One of the containers bore signs of tampering. The metal seal had been cut clean through. Inside, the container was empty. No record existed of its contents. Whether it had ever been filled remained uncertain. Klein stood in the yawning space, flashlight beam catching rust. Oil pooled in the corners. The cut on the door edge was sharp, deliberate. He took photographs, added them to the file. To Maria, when she saw them, the gash resembled the tear along Daniel's notebook cover. Steel and leather mirrored each other, both ripped open, both hollow inside. That night, Maria dreamed of pages fluttering out of the container, scattering into the dark. She woke with the image of her brother chasing them down the warehouse aisle, his hand outstretched, his face swallowed by shadow. She wrote the word container on a slip of paper and tucked it into her shoebox. The archive grew, each fragment waiting for a connection that might never come. Klein, meanwhile, tried to follow the money. He requested Daniel's bank records. Nothing obvious surfaced. No sudden transfers, no large withdrawals. But the absence itself unsettled him. If Daniel had been stealing, there should have been a trail. Instead, the accounts looked almost too ordinary. Maria pressed him for answers. Doesn't that prove he wasn't guilty? Klein hesitated. It proves he didn't profit, but people disappear for reasons other than money. The duality persisted. Rumors painted Daniel as thief, lover, runaway. The facts showed only a missing man. A torn notebook, a cut container, a footprint washed away by rain. Weeks stretched into months. Winter settled on Newark, snow layering the warehouses in white silence. The truck remained locked in the impound lot, evidence tags fading. Maria continued her routine, calling precincts, taping flyers, opening her shoebox at night to arrange and rearrange the pieces. One evening, returning from church, she found a note slid under the family's door. The paper was blank, except for a single word, written in thick marker. Book. Her father burned it in the sink before she could stop him. The flames curled the letters until nothing remained but ash, but Maria could not forget the word. Book. Not notebook, not ledger, just book. To some, it was a threat. To her, it was a reminder. The missing object was the only path to truth. The shoebox under her bed grew heavier with each fragment. The cover, the receipt, the copied boot print, the container photo, and now the memory of the note. She began to think of it less as evidence and more as ritual, a way to keep Daniel present in a world that wanted to reduce him to rumor. Detective Klein looked at the file again. Stacks of thin reports. No suspects, he muttered to himself. Just ghosts. Maria, in the dark of her room, whispered back to the silence. Not ghosts, pages. Outside, the warehouse lot stretched under snow, lights flickering against steel. Containers lined like tombs, their doors sealed, their contents unlisted. Somewhere among them lay the echo of Daniel's last route. Oil and mud merged into a single dark footprint. By February, the cold had hardened everything. Snow draped over the warehouses, muffling the rattle of trucks and flattening the usual noise of the industrial strip. Maria trudged through it anyway, boots crunching, breath white in the air. Each visit felt like walking into the same unanswered question. She had arranged another meeting with Tony DeSantis, the reluctant friend who seemed to know more than he admitted. They sat in a diner booth by the window, steam clouding the glass. Maria pushed her coffee aside. Tell me straight, she said. Was Daniel moving things he shouldn't? Tony rubbed his face, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. We all did jobs on the side. The companies know. It's how it works. But Danny didn't like it. He wrote it all down. Said if someone asked later, he'd prove he was clean. That's not how you play this game. Maria leaned closer. What game? Tony stared at the table. The one where crates don't get logged, where seals get cut and no one asks. Danny thought keeping notes kept him safe. It didn't. It marked him. Maria felt the words cut sharper than the winter air outside. The notebook again, the same ordinary object, now turned to a blade. Detective Klein pursued the warehouse lead. He arranged for a deeper inspection of the container whose lock had been cut. When they pulled the doors open, a hollow clang echoed across the yard. The inside was barren. No pallets, no packing slips, no smell of goods. Just rust streaks and oil stains at the base. The steel wall carried scratches, as though something heavy had been dragged out in haste. Klein photographed the scene, noting the clean slice on the lock. The angle suggested bolt cutters, not a master key. To him, it looked like theft. To Maria, when he showed her, it looked like erasure. Someone had wiped a record clean, the same way pages had been torn from her brother's book. At home, she laid the photos beside the torn leather cover. Steel and leather both ripped open, both left empty. She wrote "container" on another slip of paper and dropped it into her shoebox. The dual stories continued. Rumors now claimed Daniel had been involved in stealing from the warehouse itself. "He must have cut the seal," one neighbor said. "Took what he could and ran." Maria clenched her fists. The facts showed no money in his account, no sign of profit. But the whispers kept multiplying, drowning the silence with noise. One evening, Maria sat with her father on the porch. Snow fell in quiet flakes, the world muted. He held the burned scrap of the note they had received, now only ash at the bottom of a dish. "They want us afraid," he said. "That word, book. They know we'll picture the worst." Maria glanced at the shoebox by her side. "They don't need us afraid. They just need us quiet." Her father nodded, eyes dark. "But you're not quiet, are you?" "No," she said. Inside the shoebox, the fragments grew into a kind of ritual. Maria arranged them nightly. Flyer, receipt, boot print copy, torn cover, container photo, like relics of a story only she refused to let die. Each piece whispered both fact and rumor, never choosing one. Meanwhile, Klein pressed for Daniel's phone records. Weeks later, he obtained logs from a carrier, calls from a payphone near the docks, placed around 10:3 p.m. on the night before Daniel vanished. The number dialed was unregistered, tied to a burner. The call lasted less than a minute. No trace remained of its content. Maria stared at the record, the digits stark against the page. Fact: a call existed. Rumor: it was a warning, a deal, or a plea. Nothing could prove which. She returned to the warehouse lot, standing before the empty container as the wind howled through. She closed her eyes and imagined her brother writing quickly in his notebook, hands shaking, numbers running across pages. She imagined the sound of pages tearing, steel locks cutting, footsteps in the mud. She imagined silence swallowing everything. That night she dreamed again of Daniel. He stood at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen tapping. But when she looked closer, the pages were blank. He kept writing, though no ink appeared. Maria woke in darkness, the shoebox under her bed heavy with fragments. She slid it out, touched the torn leather cover, and whispered his name. The silence answered. Klein compiled his report. No suspects, no evidence of foul play. He placed it in the file. But in his notes he underlined one word twice: notebook. The file grew thicker but not clearer. Pages of statements contradicted each other. Witnesses claimed to see Daniel laughing at a bar, while others swore he was nervous and pale. Every rumor pulled in a different direction, while the facts, truck, cover, container, phone call, remained unmoving, like stones on a riverbed. Maria sat with her mother one afternoon, helping fold laundry. The older woman smoothed a shirt with trembling hands. "Your brother always believed in writing things down," she said. "He thought words could keep order." She pressed the fabric flat. "But words can also be stolen." Maria tucked the shirt into the basket, staring at the floor. The torn leather cover waited in its plastic bag, mute and damning. She imagined the missing pages scattered across warehouses, blown into alleys, tucked into crates bound for distant ports. Pages that carried numbers and names. Pages that had turned her brother from driver into target. The family clung to faith. The community clung to rumor. The police clung to procedure. And Maria clung to fragments, the shoebox growing heavier each night. On a March evening, she drove past the warehouse again. Snow had melted, leaving puddles of black water. The wind shoved the steel doors against their locks. One door swung open slightly, hinges screaming before slamming shut again. The sound echoed down the strip, empty as the container inside. The container's steel door swung open to nothing inside. Spring crept into Newark slowly, the snowmelt leaving the industrial lots slick with oil and rainwater. Rust streaked longer down the warehouse walls. Maria's shoebox of fragments sat under her bed like a heart still beating, each item heavier than the night before. The torn cover, the greasy receipt, the copied boot print, the photos of the gutted container, all lined up as though she could stitch her brother back into being by arranging them. One morning in April, she opened the front door to find an envelope slid across the threshold. No stamp, no return address, just her name scrawled in uneven letters. She carried it into the kitchen, hands trembling, her father trailing behind her. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one word, written in thick black marker, book. Her father cursed, snatched it away, and lit a match over the sink. The paper curled, blackened, fell into ash. Maria wanted to scream. To her, it was not just a threat. It was confirmation. Someone else knew what mattered. That evening, Detective Klein drove to the house. He listened quietly as Maria described the envelope. "Do you still have it?" he asked. "My father burned it." Klein sighed, writing it down. "Without the original, there's no way to test prints or ink. All I can note is that you received a threat, but off the record, they wouldn't bother if you weren't close to something." The words chilled Maria more than the paper had. Days later, another whisper spread through the neighborhood. A friend of a cousin claimed Daniel had been seen alive in Pennsylvania, working under another name. Rumor insisted he had fled, leaving debts behind, starting over clean. Maria slammed the phone down when she heard it. To her, this was not hope but erasure, a convenient story to bury him further. The family wrestled with these contradictions. Her father insisted Daniel had been targeted, punished for writing too much down. Her mother whispered prayers for his safety, clinging to the faint possibility that he still lived somewhere. Maria gathered fragments, adding rumor beside fact, stacking whispers against evidence. The notebook's role changed again. Neighbors spoke of it as though it were mythical. They called it the Black Book, a ledger men would kill for. At the parish hall, a woman leaned in close to Maria and murmured, "That book doesn't belong to your brother anymore. If he carried it, he carried a death sentence." Maria left without answering. At home, she stared at the torn leather cover sealed in plastic. To her, it was still Daniel's work log, born of family ritual. Write everything down, keep order. But in the mouths of strangers, it had grown into a relic of organized crime, a ledger of debts and names. Detective Klein tried to cut through the fog. He reviewed financial records again, searching for irregularities. Daniel's accounts remained stubbornly ordinary, but Klein noticed small deposits of cash at odd intervals, always under $200, never consistent, just enough to look like tips. To him, it suggested payoff money, hush amounts too small to change a life, but enough to keep a man silent. He called Maria to the precinct. "Look at these," he said, sliding the statements across the desk. Maria traced the numbers with her finger. They matched a rhythm she recognized, amounts that mirrored the way Daniel used to jot figures in his notebook. She remembered him tapping the pen against the margin, murmuring about exact sums, precise to the dollar. "Why such small amounts?" she asked. "Because big amounts get noticed," Klein said. "But a little at a time, that's how you buy silence." Silence, Maria thought, was the only thing left. That night, she dreamed again of Daniel, seated at the kitchen table, notebook open. But instead of writing, he tore page after page, feeding them to a flame that never consumed them fully. Each sheet curled but refused to disappear, ashes clinging to her hands. She woke with a taste of smoke in her throat. The next morning, she found a new flyer taped to her door. It was one of her own. The photo of Daniel faded from rain. Across the bottom, someone had scrawled in thick marker, "Stop." Her father wanted to take it down immediately. Maria insisted on keeping it. She placed it in the shoebox with the others. The fragments were becoming more than evidence. They were ritual objects, each carrying the weight of absence, each humming with threat. The police remained cautious. Klein logged the events, but warned Maria, "You're circling dangerous ground. Whoever sent these notes wants you afraid. They want you silent." Maria shook her head. "They want me to stop asking about the book. That means it still matters." She began to write her own notes now, in a small journal she carried. Not because she believed it would protect her, but because writing was the only way to resist erasure. She copied the numbers from Daniel's bank statements, the dates of the phone calls, the words from the burned note. Page after page, she built her own ledger of shadows. The dual narrative thickened. Rumors shouted that Daniel had betrayed his crew, or stolen, or fled. Fact whispered through fragments. A footprint in mud, a torn cover, a cut container, a call to a burner, a single word. Book. Both layers twisted together until truth was unreachable. On a wet evening, Maria drove past the warehouse strip again. Rain glistened under sodium lamps. The same container doors shuddered in the wind. She pulled over, sat in her car, and stared at the rusting wall where Daniel's truck had once stood. She imagined him stepping out, notebook in hand, unaware that pages could mark him more than any weapon. The wind rattled the doors once, then settled. The silence pressed harder than the noise. The single word pulsed heavier than any threat. Book. The Italian restaurant stood at the corner of a narrow street, its neon sign flickering against damp brick. Families still came in for pasta and red wine, but Maria's visit was not for dinner. She carried Daniel's flyer folded in her bag, worn at the edges. It had become her calling card, the only thing she could show when she asked the same question again and again. Have you seen him? Inside, the air smelled of garlic and smoke. The owner, a broad man with slicked hair, looked up sharply when she mentioned her brother's name. His smile tightened. We see a lot of drivers, he said. Couldn't tell you one from another, Maria pressed. This receipt was found in his truck, from here. He glanced at the paper she held, shrugged. Must have been 100 receipts that day. You want sauce with your story? He turned away before she could answer, but one of the younger waiters lingered. He was barely 20, his apron stained, hands restless as he cleared a table near hers. When the owner stepped into the kitchen, the boy leaned in. I saw him, he whispered. Couple weeks before he disappeared. He sat right there, booth in the corner, had a little book, kept writing. Maria's pulse quickened. Was he alone? The boy shook his head. 2 men came in. Both wore leather jackets. They sat across from him, leaned close. I didn't hear what they said, but he didn't look happy. Looked cornered. Maria asked for details, but the boy grew nervous, glancing toward the kitchen. That's all I can say, he muttered. Don't drag me into this. She slipped him a flyer anyway. If you remember more, call me. Outside, rain slicked the pavement. Maria stood beneath the sign, staring at the booth through the window. She imagined Daniel hunched over his notebook, 2 shadows looming across from him. The scene burned into her mind, half memory, half invention. When she told Detective Klein, he frowned. 2 men in jackets in an Italian restaurant. That's half the neighborhood. But he had the notebook, Maria pressed. Someone saw him writing. Klein tapped his pen. Or someone saw what they wanted to see. Rumors are contagious. Still, he requested the restaurant's internal tapes. Weeks later, he received a grainy video file. The angle was bad, the corner booth half hidden. But there was Daniel, his profile clear enough, a pen moving in his hand. Moments later, 2 larger figures slid into the booth, their faces blurred by distance, leather jackets gleaming under fluorescent light. They leaned in. The camera caught no sound, only the posture. Daniel stiff, the men looming. Then the tape ended. Maria watched it over and over. To her, it confirmed everything. To Klein, it was still inconclusive. We can't identify them. Could be friends, could be enemies. Without context, it's just shadows. But Maria held on to the image. Her brother, pen in hand, still writing. She wrote the word restaurant on a slip of paper and added it to her shoebox. Rumor responded as if fed by fire. Now the story spread that Daniel had been recruiting into a crew, that he wanted more than deliveries, that he was making deals. At the corner store, Maria overheard 2 men say, he thought he could play with the big boys. Didn't last long. She clenched her teeth, said nothing, and walked out. At home, she pulled out the torn cover. She imagined the missing pages filled with names, numbers, places. Not secrets of ambition, but desperate attempts to protect himself, to document what others wanted erased. Her father remained silent, drinking coffee late into the night. Her mother prayed in whispers, rosary beads clicking like a clock. The house lived in contradiction. One half clinging to faith, the other drowning in fragments. Detective Klein tried to widen the scope. He contacted federal agents, hoping the restaurant tape might spark interest. The answer was curt. Not enough. Unless you can prove interstate activity, it's not our file. The case remained in limbo, passed back and forth until it gathered dust. But Maria refused dust. She copied the receipt by hand into her journal, wrote down the details the waiter had given, described the blurred jackets. Her own notebook filled slowly, a mirror of her brother's lost one. At night, she dreamed again of the booth. Daniel sat with his pen. The men leaned close. But when she tried to step closer, the camera's static grew louder until it drowned their voices. She woke sweating, the sound of the static still in her ears. One afternoon, she returned to the restaurant. She sat at the same booth, ordered a coffee, and placed her notebook on the table. The seat felt colder than it should have. She wrote Daniel's name at the top of the page, then drew 2 dark lines beneath it. No one approached her, but she felt eyes from the kitchen watching. She left quickly, the notebook pressed against her chest. The streets outside smelled of rain and smoke. Maria walked past shuttered shops, headlights smearing the wet asphalt. The image of her brother in that booth refused to fade. Fact and rumor blurred, but one detail held constant. The notebook, always in his hands, always pulling him toward danger. At the end of the block, she turned back once more. Through the restaurant's fogged window, the corner booth sat empty, shadows pooling where he had once written. 2 leather jackets leaned in, blotting Daniel from the frame. The neighborhood had stopped speaking of Daniel as a missing man and started speaking of him as a cautionary tale. In bars and diners, his story bent with each retelling. Some said he'd stolen, others said he'd fled. Few said he had been taken. Rumor hardened like plaster until even family friends repeated it as fact. Maria sat at the parish basement one evening, listening as volunteers pinned up flyers of the vanished. Her brother's photo hung beside others, faces faded by rain, names curling at the corners. She overheard 2 men whispering near the coffee urn. "He took off with cash, that's what I heard." Then why's the sister still hanging flyers? Maria stood and walked out before her anger broke through. Detective Klein, meanwhile, kept digging. The restaurant tape nagged at him. The blurred figures in jackets. The way Daniel kept writing. He pressed for Daniel's bank records again, combing through every statement. That was when he noticed the pattern more clearly. There were deposits, always in cash, never large enough to trigger alarms. $100, $150, sometimes $200. They arrived irregularly, but frequent enough to suggest routine. The totals meant little in themselves, but the rhythm was familiar to anyone who had handled drivers paid under the table. Klein called Maria to his office. He laid the statements across the desk. "These deposits. Look at the dates." She leaned in, her breath caught. Each date matched the times she remembered Daniel working late, the runs that took him beyond the usual routes. "It's not profit," she said. "It's payment for something he didn't want." "Or for silence," Klein added. "Too small for greed, just enough to keep him moving. But moving what?" The dual narrative sharpened. Rumor painted Daniel as greedy. Fact suggested he was cornered. Maria wrote deposits on a slip of paper and added it to her shoebox. Her father remained unconvinced of anything but betrayal against his son. "They're twisting it," he muttered over coffee. He wrote things down, and that scared them. These deposits, they're crumbs. They prove nothing. Maria wasn't so sure. The notebook had always been Daniel's tether to order. Now it seemed like the very record of those crumbs, the trail he couldn't leave behind. That week, Klein received an anonymous tip left on his desk. A scrap of paper torn from a ledger, folded twice. On one side, greasy fingerprints blurred the edges. On the other, faint writing curved across the page. It looked like Daniel's hand. Maria was called in to view it. The numbers ran down the page, neatly aligned, then stopped abruptly. The bottom half of the sheet had been torn clean away. "It's his," she whispered. "I know that script. He always looped his sevens." Klein bagged the fragment. "Chain of custody starts here, but without the rest, we can't prove context." Maria pressed her hand to the plastic. The smear of oil on the page smelled faintly of machinery, sharp and metallic. It felt alive, like breath from the warehouse lot. She dreamed that night of pages fluttering through the air, half torn, carried into dark water. She reached for them, but they dissolved into grease that coated her hands. Rumor twisted again. The same week the ledger fragments surfaced. Whispers rose that Daniel had been working with a rival crew, keeping track of money meant for others. Some claim the missing notebook was a ledger of betrayal, evidence he had double-crossed. Maria slammed the door on one neighbor who repeated it. But inside, she felt the weight of contradiction. If Daniel had been recording payoffs, was he documenting for protection or for leverage? Klein filed the ledger fragment carefully, adding it to the evidence room. But even he felt the shadow of larger forces. Anonymous evidence did not appear by accident. Someone wanted them to see part of the truth, and never the whole. Maria visited the warehouse strip again, this time alone at night. Sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting yellow pools on the wet asphalt. She stood where the truck had once been, imagining her brother at the wheel, notebook in his pocket, headlights reflecting on steel doors. She thought of the deposits, the fragment, the two men in jackets. Fact and rumor circled each other until she felt dizzy. She took out her own small notebook, the one she had started carrying, and wrote the date in block letters. Beneath it, she copied the numbers from the fragment, line by line, even though she did not know their meaning. Her hand trembled, but the act steadied her. To rewrite his notes was to refuse his erasure. The wind rattled a container door. Maria looked up. For a moment, she swore she saw her brother's silhouette across the lot, standing still, notebook in hand. But when she blinked, the space was empty. Only rusted steel and echo. Back home, she slipped the new slip of paper, ledger fragment, into the shoebox. The collection swelled like a second heartbeat. The next morning, she found another flyer taped to her door. Her own again. Daniel's photo staring back. Across it, someone had written in red ink, "Stop digging." She folded it neatly and placed it with the others. Evidence and ritual, rumor and fact, all collapsed into the same box. The deposits stacked like shadows no one could trace. Luis Ortega had been off the road for years. His back gave out before his 30th birthday, and he now worked part-time fixing tires in a garage that smelled of rubber and gasoline. Maria found him after weeks of asking around, chasing every name Daniel had once mentioned. When she showed Ortega the flyer, he sighed and looked away. "Danny," he muttered, rubbing grease from his hands. "Yeah, I knew him. Good driver, careful, too careful." Maria leaned on the counter. "What do you mean?" Ortega lowered his voice. "We all took side jobs. Extra crates, no paperwork. That's the life. But Danny, he didn't just take the money. He kept a record, wrote it all down. I told him it was dangerous. He said he couldn't help it. Said he needed proof in case something went wrong." Maria swallowed. The notebook again, always the notebook. "Did he ever say why?" Ortega nodded. "He was scared. Said the notebook would outlive him if it had to. That's when I knew he was in trouble." Later that week, an envelope appeared at Detective Klein's desk. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a page torn from a ledger, creased, smeared with oil. The handwriting was Daniel's. Neat, slanted, numbers aligned in columns. Midway down, the ink stopped, as though the pen had been yanked away. The lower half of the sheet had been ripped clean off. Klein bagged it and called Maria. She pressed her face to the plastic sleeve, tracing the lines with her finger. "It's his. I'd know his hand anywhere. Look at the sevens, the loops." Klein nodded. "Someone wants us to see this much and nothing more." Whoever dropped it knew exactly what they were doing. The fragment turned the case again. Rumor bloomed. Daniel had been double-booking routes, stealing names from one crew and selling them to another. They said the missing pages carried a map of betrayal, proof he played both sides. Maria rejected it, but doubt pressed against her ribs. If Daniel had documented deals, had he been protecting himself or holding leverage? The fragment could be shield or weapon, fact or rumor. She carried the copy home, slipped another note into her shoebox. Ledger fragment. The collection had grown into a ritual. Each night she laid the pieces out on her bed like cards. The greasy receipt, the boot print photo, the container shot, the flyer marked "Stop," the word book burned in memory, and now the fragment. Together they whispered a story, but never the same one twice. Her father refused to look. "They're feeding you scraps," he growled over dinner. "They want you chasing ghosts. That's how they win." Maria answered softly, "If the notebook mattered to them, it matters to me." Klein took the fragment to handwriting experts. The verdict came back consistent with Daniel's writing, but without the missing half, context was gone. The numbers could mean deliveries, debts, or something else entirely. A record without a key. Maria visited Ortega again, demanding clarity. He wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head. "I told him, stop writing, but he said, if I don't, they'll erase me." Those were his words. That night, she dreamed of Daniel again, seated at the kitchen table. He wrote furiously, pages piling high. But each time she tried to pick one up, the paper dissolved into grease, black smears staining her hands. He kept writing, face blank, until the stack collapsed into ash. Rumor kept pace with fact. The same week the fragment appeared, someone spray-painted across a warehouse wall. Ledger lies. Maria drove past it at dawn, headlights catching the dripping paint. She stopped the car, stared at the words, and felt the city itself whispering against her. Klein grew more cautious. He stopped sharing details outside his office, convinced that each new clue was planted to control the story. "We're being managed," he admitted. "Every piece arrives because someone wants it to." "Then why not give us the whole book?" Maria asked. "Because the whole book is too dangerous," Klein said. The idea chilled her. At home, she copied the fragment by hand into her own notebook, line by line. She imagined Daniel doing the same, sitting in silence, writing as if words could resist disappearance. Her notebook became shadow to his, an echo trying to keep pace. The dual narrative deepened. Rumor now claimed Daniel had been caught embezzling, that the notebook was forged evidence against his own crew. Fact offered only fragments, torn pages, numbers without meaning. Maria carried both truths like stones in her chest. Late one evening, she received another anonymous call. A man's voice, distorted. "Stop digging. The book is gone. He's gone. Leave it." The line went dead before she could respond. She wrote the words "he's gone" on a slip of paper and added it to the shoebox. The weight pressed against her chest as she slid it under the bed. The next morning, she drove past the warehouse again. Mist clung to the lot, the corrugated siding streaked with rust. For a moment, she thought she saw movement inside, a shadow passing behind the steel doors. She stepped out of her car, stood in the damp silence, listening. Only the buzz of a lamp overhead. The wind pushed the door slightly open, then shut again with a hollow clang. The sound echoed like a page torn from a book, half a page ripped out, the rest smeared with grease. The grand jury met in a windowless room on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Maria sat in the hallway with her father, the shoebox of fragments resting on her lap like a child. Inside the chamber, Detective Klein presented his thin file. The truck abandoned outside the warehouse, the cut container, the phone log from the docks, the oil-smeared ledger fragment. The jurors listened, nodded, scribbled notes. But when witnesses were called, silence swallowed the room. Tony DeSantis never showed. The young waiter from the restaurant recanted, saying he must have been mistaken. Luis Ortega refused to testify, muttering about family to protect. Even Maria's Uncle Vincent claimed he misremembered his earlier statement. One by one, the voices that had once spoken Daniel's name folded into silence. The prosecutor shrugged when it ended. "Without cooperation, there's no case," she told Maria. "Hearsay isn't evidence. Rumor isn't proof." Maria opened her shoebox and laid the fragments across the table. The greasy receipt, the photo of the boot print, the container shot, the flyer scrawled "stop," the word "book" etched into memory, the torn leather cover, the ledger fragment. To her, they were a chorus. To the court, they were scraps. Detective Klein tried to salvage something. He submitted the torn cover into evidence officially. It was photographed, tagged, sealed in plastic, assigned a number, and placed on the shelf of the evidence room. Maria hated the way it looked. Flat, sterile, robbed of its history. The notebook that had once lived in her brother's hands, filled with his pen strokes, was reduced to a husk in a bag. At home, her father stared at the photo of Daniel pinned above the mantel. "They'll let it die," he muttered. That's how it ends. Not with an answer, but with nothing. Maria wanted to protest, but the silence of the grand jury echoed louder than her words. She closed the shoebox carefully and slid it beneath her bed. Even the fragments seemed heavier now, burdened by official indifference. Weeks later, she received a letter in the mail. Not anonymous this time, official stationery. The county declared the investigation suspended pending new evidence. The words were formal, clinical, devoid of empathy. Maria sat on her porch with the letter in her lap. Her mother prayed inside. Her father smoked silently at the kitchen table. The whole house seemed caught between ritual and resignation. She walked to the impound lot that evening. The guard let her through, tired of seeing her face. Daniel's truck still sat under tarps, rust creeping along the wheel wells. She pressed her hand against the metal door. Inside, the cab was stripped bare. Only the faint indent of where a notebook once pressed against the seat fabric. She imagined him there, pen scratching, trying to anchor himself in ink against a tide he could not stop. Detective Klein met her outside the lot. His voice was tired. "This is where it ends, Maria. Without pages, without names, there's nothing left to chase." Maria shook her head. The pages mattered. They still do, even if they're gone. Klein sighed. "You can't build a case on ghosts." "But you can't erase a man with silence either," she said. That night she dreamed again. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the torn cover before him. He opened it and turned invisible pages, one after another, as though they still existed. When she reached to touch them, her hand met only air. She woke with tears on her face. In May, Maria visited the evidence room for the first time. A clerk led her down aisles of shelves stacked with boxes, bags, tagged objects sealed away. She spotted it quickly. A clear plastic bag with the label Russo, Daniel, item 17. Inside lay the torn leather cover, cracked, empty, meaningless. She pressed her forehead against the glass and whispered his name. The clerk cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you can't touch it." She nodded, but did not move. The notebook had become everything and nothing. Ordinary object, family ritual, whispered myth, forensic artifact. Now it was a hollow exhibit, sealed away with no context. Maria left the courthouse carrying only silence. She walked the blocks toward the warehouse strip, the evening air heavy with summer heat. The doors rattled in the wind, the same hollow clang that had echoed since the night her brother vanished. Back home, she opened the shoebox one last time. She placed the letter of suspension on top of the fragments, sealing them in silence. She slid the box under her bed and sat in the dark, listening to the house creak. The notebook's cover remained on a shelf across town, tagged and forgotten. To the system, it was a meaningless scrap. To Maria, it was the last voice her brother had left. She whispered into the empty room, "You wrote it down. That's why you're gone." The shoebox under her bed felt heavier than stone. Only the empty cover remained, tagged and sealed in plastic. 2 decades slid by like rust spreading across steel. The warehouses along the Newark Strip had changed owners, changed names, but never their skin. Corrugated walls still bore streaks of rust. Container doors still rattled in the wind. Trucks still came and went, carrying loads no one tracked too closely. To most, it was background noise. To Maria Russo, it remained a wound that never closed. Her brother's case was no longer in any active file. The county called it suspended, a word that meant forgotten. But Maria never stopped. She kept the shoebox under her bed, now filled with yellowed papers, copies of flyers, bank statements, the greasy receipt, photos of the boot print and container, the ledger fragment folded into plastic. Above them lay the county's suspension letter, its words faded to gray. Every year on October 23rd, she lit a candle on the kitchen table. Her father had passed by then. Her mother sat quietly beside her, rosary beads slipping through fingers. The candle burned while Daniel's photograph stared from its frame. the same image repeated on 100 old flyers. The notebook, or what remained of it, still sat in the evidence room across town. Maria visited sometimes, signing her name in the log, walking the aisles until she found the bag labeled Russo, Daniel, item 17. Inside was only the torn leather cover, spine cracked, pages forever gone. Clerks hardly glanced at her anymore. To them, it was just another shelf, another tag. But to Maria, that cover carried a pulse. It was the symbol that had transformed over the years. First ordinary, then family ritual, then whispered legend of a mob black book, finally reduced to forensic artifact. Each stage echoed Daniel's absence louder. Rumors never stopped. New voices replaced old, reshaping the story each time. Some claimed Daniel lived under another name in another state. Others insisted he had been executed and buried beneath concrete. Maria had learned not to argue. Rumor was a tide that never receded. Fact lived only in fragments, sealed in bags and boxes. One summer, Maria stood at the edge of the old warehouse lot, weeds climbing through cracked pavement. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine that night again. The truck angled wrong against the wall, the keys in the ignition, the styrofoam cup with its skim of cold coffee, the driver's seat shoved too far back. She imagined Daniel stepping out, notebook in hand, believing words would shield him. She imagined two men in leather jackets closing in, the pages torn before they ever reached safety. She opened her own notebook, the one she had carried for years now, and copied the scene. She wrote the date, the time, the objects. She wrote as if by writing she could anchor her brother back into being. Her pen moved until dusk, until the street lamps buzzed awake and shadows filled the lot. Detective Klein had long since retired, but he still answered her calls sometimes. "Cases like this," he said once, "they rot in the dark. People stop looking, not because there's nothing left, but because there's too much." Maria asked if he believed the notebook had truly existed the way rumor described it. He hesitated. Maybe it was just pages of numbers. Maybe it was a map of debts. Or maybe it was nothing at all, and everyone filled the silence with fear. That's the thing about missing words. They get louder once they're gone. At home, Maria lit another candle and opened the shoebox. She arranged the fragments across the table. The receipt, the boot print, the flyer marked "Stop," the ledger fragment, the suspension letter. Each piece was meaningless alone. Together they hummed with absence. She placed Daniel's photograph at the center and whispered, "I still hear you." The notebook had become her brother's ghost. Not his face, not his voice, but the object he had trusted most. It had carried his order, his care, his fear. It had been stolen, turned into legend, then stripped to a cover in plastic. And in that journey it mirrored the story itself. Fact torn into rumor, evidence swallowed into silence. Outside, the warehouse doors rattled once in the wind, the same hollow clang that had echoed for 20 years. Maria closed the shoebox and slid it beneath her bed. She turned off the light and lay in darkness, listening to the quiet pulse of the house. Somewhere across town, on a shelf no one checked anymore, the leather cover waited, its spine cracked, its pages forever erased, tagged with a number that meant nothing outside its file. And yet for Maria, it was still her brother's voice, mute, incomplete, haunting. The cover waits on a shelf, its pages forever erased.